My name is Lucerito Ortiz. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And I'd love to take a moment to introduce myself. And at Promise 54, we encourage what we call radically human introductions. And these are introductions that center the things that matter most to us and have made us who we are. So for me, that has to include my parents. I am the proud daughter of immigrant parents. My mother is from Guatemala, my father is from Mexico. I grew up helping my mother clean houses. I would observe that the ways that her clients spoke to her and would always feel frustrated because it felt like in the best case scenarios, I would see her clients dumb down their language toward her and then turn around and praise me for my quote unquote very good English as someone born and raised in this country. In the worst case scenarios, I would see her get verbally abused when a mistake was made or accused of theft when something went missing. I grew up angry that people didn't seem to recognize or honor my parents' humanity, their courage, their brilliance. My parents never had the opportunity to pursue education in the ways that they wanted. My mother always dreamed of going to college, but didn't have the chance to do so in her home country. And my father had to stop his education after the 3rd grade because his family couldn't afford to have him in school. Coming to this country, my parents viewed education as our golden ticket, as their children's pathway to social mobility. And it really was for me. I grew up loving school. I had so many teachers who went out of their way to help my parents navigate a system that was foreign to them, in a language foreign to them. And as a result, I had access to a magnet program. I had access to resources and opportunities that many others in my family didn't. And I grew up deeply grateful for the sacrifices that so many had made for the sake of my education. And as I grew older, that gratitude became mixed with frustration. I was frustrated that so many sacrifices were necessary for that to be true. And this was the seed for my interest in educational access and equity. Through the love and support of so many throughout my life, I found myself at Harvard College as a first-generation college student. And it was at Harvard that I learned the difference between access and inclusion. That simply being in a place does not necessarily mean that you feel of a place. My parents, for all of their sacrifices and pride in having me there, never wanted to attend any Harvard events because they felt so out of place, so uncomfortable. They felt the same way that they did in front of their clients. So fundamentally, my commitment to this work of diversity, equity, and inclusion comes from a deep desire to create spaces where my parents can walk in and feel fully seen, fully accepted, fully valued. I've always known that my parents deserve that. And I have more recently connected with the idea that I do too, and that we all do. And for that reason, I am deeply humbled to be a part of this organization, Promise 54, whose mission is to do just that, to create spaces where adults can thrive and be their full human selves. We believe that DI is a precondition for social justice, and in order to fully live out our missions, as social justice organizations, we must do this work internally as well. And we support organizations through individualized tailored support, through shared cohort experiences, and also through research, which is what brings us into this conversation today. We released our first Unrealized Impact Report in 2017 based on data from 5,000 individuals and 200 organizations. And we wanted to understand, how is the education sector doing on DEI? The results at that time were sobering and showed we had a long way to go. This new 2.0 report we just released now includes an expanded data set of 28,000 individuals and 500 organizations. It's the largest study of its kind on DEI in the field of education. And we hope this represents a bold call to action for organizations to engage in the work of becoming diverse, inclusive, equitable, and anti-racist on our journey to fulfill our organizational missions as well. In today's conversation, we wanted to dig into one of our key themes around anti-Blackness. As we reviewed and analyzed our data across multiple indicators, the pattern was undeniable. Black staff, and in particular Black women, report among the least positive experiences across diversity, inclusion, and equity. And it's really quite bone-chilling when we look at it all together. Across all three of these categories, inclusion, we see that Black women experience among the lowest levels of inclusion of all women and men, and Black men experience the lowest levels among men. Black women experience among the lowest levels of equity among all women and men, and we see the same for Black men. When we look at rates of experiencing bias, nearly 40% of Black women report experiencing bias, among the highest of all women and men. Black men report among the highest rates among all men, and 46% of Black LGBTQIA+ respondents report experiencing bias. So we see the effect that intersectionality has for Black staff in particular as well. Ultimately, to us, this data indicates that the very organizations allegedly working toward equity and justice for young people, including Black students, families, and communities, may in fact be perpetuating anti-Blackness ourselves. And this has deep implications for the individual and the collective experiences of Black staff working in education and for organizations as well. Our data shows a negative correlation between bias and what we view as proxies for safety, satisfaction, and retention, which are net promoter scores, intent to stay scores, and the percent of staff who feel that they can bring their whole selves to work. This is a strong call to action for us to identify, interrogate, and dismantle anti-Blackness at the sector level, the organizational level, and the individual level. And that's the conversation we want to invite you into today. Now, I want to be clear, what we are not here to do today is to ask our Black colleagues to help us figure out how to eradicate anti-Blackness while also persisting through it. Instead, what we are going to do is invite Black folks into a conversation with two phenomenal leaders, Kira Orange-Jones and Dr. Rob Harvey, to talk about persistence and resistance, restoration, and self-care as they carry on in the face of persisting anti-Blackness. Kira Orange-Jones is the District 2 representative for the Louisiana State Board of Elementary and Secondary Education. She was selected by Time magazine as one of 100 most influential people in the world because of her contributions to the field of education. She was a Teach for America Peter Jennings Alumni Excellence winner and was an Aspen Institute Education Entrepreneurship Fellow. Dr. Rob Harvey is Superintendent of East Harlem Scholars Academies and Chief Academic Officer of East Harlem Tutorial Program. His prior roles have included being head of school at Star Academy College Prep and serving as COO and senior lecturer at Simmons College. He earned a doctorate in leadership and society from the Memphis Theological Seminary, a master's in theological studies from Harvard University, and a bachelor's from Bryant University. In the spring of next year, his second book, Teaching as Protest, Emancipating Classrooms Through Racial Consciousness, will be released. Now, while our Black colleagues enter into this conversation, if they so wish, we invite everyone else into our second conversation, where we will be grappling with key questions on what it looks like and what is required to intentionally walk down the path to eradicate anti-Blackness. So we'll be inviting you into conversation with two amazing leaders from Alliance College Ready Public Schools, a charter network in the Los Angeles area. Alliance has been on an intentional journey from DEI work to anti-racism work, and then directly into anti-Blackness work. And they're going to vulnerably share how their journey is playing out right now in real time as they navigate the messiness, while we all have an opportunity to reflect and engage with some key questions. In this conversation, we will have Jessica Smith, who is Vice President of Employee Relations and Engagement for Alliance. And she has previously supported employee relations at Atlanta Public Schools, and has also represented school districts in employment law matters. She holds a bachelor's in history and English from the University of Miami and a JD from Emory. We will also be joined by Dan Katzir, who is the CEO of Alliance, and his previous roles have included serving as an independent strategic education advisor to CEOs and boards of directors within the nonprofit education sector and managing director at the Broad Foundation. Dan has an MBA from Harvard and has received a bachelor's in history from Dartmouth. Right. So as we invite you into these spaces, to review, we will be inviting Black staff only into a conversation with Kira and Rob. And to be clear, Black staff are not required to join this conversation. You can feel free to join whichever conversation you see fit for yourself in this moment. But we do ask that non-Black staff respect the space and privacy that we are intentionally creating for Black staff. Everyone else will be joining me and Xiomara in a conversation with Jessica and Dan from Alliance. And I do want to take a moment to acknowledge that racial affinity spaces are inherently reductionist and likely don't capture the complexity and intersectionality of identity, but our intent here is to create a space of safety and shared experience for Black participants specifically, while acknowledging the inherent complexity within. Right. So before we send people off into breakouts, is there anything I can clarify around what we are about to do in conversation right now? Right. And Xiomara, did we have folks needing interpretation? Okay.
I haven't heard from anyone yet.
All right. Louis, I will hand it over to you to let us know how the breakouts will work.
Sure. Thank you so much, Lucerito. Folks, in just a moment, I will be opening the breakout rooms and you'll be able to select the room that you'd like to go to. And so for those who identify as Black, if you'd like to go to the space with Kira and Rob, you can choose that one. And anyone, of course, is welcome to join the second breakout with our colleagues from Alliance.
Thanks, Yo, and thank you for that appreciation. Hi, good morning, everyone. For me, it's morning. I'm in LA. My name is Jessica Smith, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. And to be honest, I'm coming into this space today a little bit nervous. When Zio asked me to do this, I was like, wait a second. You're going to send all the Black people to a different space, and then I'm going to be in the space with non-Black people. I was like, I don't know about that. And so I had to think about it, right? Because it didn't feel right to not participate in the conversation about anti-Blackness at Alliance, being Black and leading the work, but then it also didn't feel right to be present. So I'm navigating that as I'm talking to you all today. But I think what made the decision really clear for me is remembering who I am and remembering who I come from and the people I come from. So my family are immigrants from Jamaica, and I'm a first generation American. And recently, over the last couple of years, I lost my grandmother and my dad. My mom is still alive. And in hearing the stories of impact that my grandmother and my dad had on people's lives and even my mom's lives, it's clear to me that their story is my story, right? So they came here to this country not knowing anyone, never knowing anyone. That's usually how immigrants come here, right? And made a way for themselves, but also made a way for other people. And I've watched my parents, I watched my grandmother over the course of their lives, bring other people along in their journey, create space for other people in their journey, not only me, but people that they've only met one time, create space for them. And so as I come into spaces, right, I ask myself, how can I create spaces for others? How can I create spaces of radical belonging for other people, right? And so I consider myself to be an atmosphere shifter. That means whenever I walk into a space, I ask myself, how can it be different when I leave? And that's what brings me to the work. My belief in people, my belief in people's humanity, my belief that people should have spaces of belonging, my faith grounds me, right? And the history of my people is how I show up and is how I'm showing up to you today. I'm really excited to enter the conversation with you all today and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you for the generous intro, Jessica, and for naming the complexity of the way in which you're entering this space. We have got you, and just really appreciate your generosity of being here. Dan, you want to introduce yourself in whatever way feels radically human to you?
Great, happy to do that. Hello, everyone. Good morning from LA. It is really cold out here this morning. Winter has hit. It's like 65 degrees. So we have our fur coats out and everything. Just appreciation back to Xiomara and the Promise 54 crew. We would not be in this space had they not been our guide, our provokers, our thought partners, and our strategists and coaches on our DEI and anti-racism journey. So I'm excited to share all the beautiful and the messy that we have had, both with Promise 54 and then after, once they left and we kind of took the mantle on ourselves, and Jessica and her team in particular, leading the work at our network. I grew up in Miami, Florida, so I'm a warm weather guy, except for a little stint in the Northeast for school. I grew up with just my mom, who was a junior high school English teacher. And so education was always very important to me. And I knew that it was important because of her and how I grew up. And I really wanted to be able to do something in education. And my first job after graduate school was in year one at Teach for America, and that is I worked in the New York office. I was a teacher, but in private school, not through TFA, and that is really what launched me into the social justice work that's so important to me in K through 12 public education. I haven't looked back since, and have just had really the most joyous time being able to lead a public charter school network serving low-income kids in historically oppressed communities throughout Los Angeles. And I'm excited to be able to talk about our DEI and anti-racism work, because even after 2 decades of doing public education, this was a big gap for me. And it's been both a personal and professional rough and joyous ride to learn and to personally unlearn and relearn a lot of things that I thought were the way that turned out to actually not be that way at all. So happy to be here in this space with you all today.
Awesome. Thanks, Dan. Okay, y'all, here's how we're going to run this. I'm going to ask a few questions for Dan and Jessica, maybe a question, a follow-up or two. And I'm hoping as you're listening and engaging with them, you can feel free to react in the chat, respond in the chat, give them some love, make sure they know we've got them here. That would be great. If you have questions, throw those in the chat too. I'll be scanning, as is Lucerito, and we can try to weave those into the conversation. But let's also I'd love to also encourage you all to be thinking from the perspective of your own personal work and the work going on in your own organizations, thinking about what you can take from this conversation straight into that work. And we'll pause for a couple of moments at various points in this conversation and turn the conversation to you all and give you some time to reflect on what you're hearing and take down some notes about what you might do with what you're hearing. So we will pause at various moments for some audience reflection time. So let's get into it. I would love, first of all, Jessica and Dan, for you all to catch us up on this journey at Alliance that you all have been on. I'll frame a couple questions and you sort of enter wherever catches you. What is anti-Blackness to you? How would you describe the concept, first and foremost? And as you think about the journey Alliance has been on, how has anti-Blackness specifically come to be centered for you all at Alliance? Maybe there's a story you want to tell in terms of the journey from entering into DEI work generally to getting more specific in terms of anti-racism, and then honing all the way in on anti-Blackness specifically. So will you give us the shorthand catch up on the journey to date, landing you in this spot of really centering and focusing on anti-Blackness? And whoever can kick it off.
I can kick it off, Dan. So for me, anti-Blackness, and this is a quote from Professor Kiana Ross, is the inability to recognize Black humanity. That's at the core what anti-Blackness is to me. And as Yamara said, we're going to talk about anti-Blackness at Alliance in our journey, but I want to be clear, it did not start there. We are a couple years into our journey and only most recently have really centered on anti-Blackness. So our journey as a whole organization really begins in about 2017, 2018, our anti-racist journey. And it really started with the question of why are people of color leaving our organization, and at that time, particularly our home office, at such a high rate? That's where the question began. And why are we seeing, why are like groups of people in pockets in different parts of the organization seeing the experiences of not only Black staff, but also people of color staff who identifies people of color? Why are we seeing that their experience is different in this organization? That's where the journey started, by asking the question. I'd say then we moved in probably about 2018 to DEI. Right? So let's talk about diversity, equity, inclusion in this organization. What does that look like? What does equity mean to us? What does diversity mean? What does inclusion mean? So it started again by asking questions, right? And forming a DEI working group at the time who started to push the organization to ask these questions. And then over time, it evolved from there, from DEI to what does anti-racism mean, right? And when we say that word, what does that mean? And I think that became pivotal probably for us in 2019-20, right? As the outward atmosphere outside of Alliance also began to shift in the country, and we started to focus more on anti-racism. And then I'd say for us, the key turning point, for me, at least from my viewpoint, into anti-Blackness was last summer, when all of the racial reckoning was happening across the organization, across the country. And at Alliance, we held forums for our Black staff, students, and scholars during June and July of 2020. And I sat in those forums, and what I heard about the experience of our staff, scholars, and families was so heavy that after that forum, I had to go lay down. Because as a Black person working in the organization, to hear, I knew in my heart, but to like hear verbally, this is what people are experiencing, it was too much to really handle. And that's the pivotal moment, I think, for in our organization, where we shifted just from DEI, anti-racism, to we have to focus on anti-Blackness, and what does that mean for our organization?
Yep. So maybe just to pick it up from there, when Promise 54, so a couple contextual things about Alliance College Ready Public Schools. So we're 13,000 kids, 26 middle and high schools. We were founded by an African-American educator who was bilingual Spanish. She came over from LA Unified School District, was an innovator and a leader there, led the organization for the first 11 years, retired, and then I am the second CEO in the organization. Her name is Judy Burton. So Alliance has always had a history of having large numbers of staff who are people of color. We are 70% people of color across all employee groups, from custodians up to the executive team. That said, when Promise 54 did its survey with us, our net promoter score for Black and African-American staff was -100, which is as low as you can go. And so that was a wake-up call. What Jessica shared for the qualitative conversations that we had with Black and African-American staff, scholars, and families through our forums and through some other town hall things that we did at our schools, those lived experiences and those stories were not just heart-wrenching, they were awful. And as the leader of the organization, it was a huge slap in the face, wake-up call, tornado, tsunami for me, because all of those stories had happened under my watch. And so the first step for us post-racial reckoning nationally was for me to have a conversation with my board about a public statement that they would make first around their commitment both to anti-racism and being a pro-Black public school system. The second piece, so that happened in June. Jessica, help me, I'm bad on years. What was June of 20? And then we start school on August 1st. So that was at the end of that school year. We kick off with what we call One Alliance Day with all 1,400 of our staff on August 1st. Obviously, that year was in Zoom because of the pandemic. But the focus of that launch of the school year was for me, for the board to reiterate their commitment, and then for me to take personal responsibility for how we had really not lived up to our mission and our commitment to the communities that we serve, and in particular to our staff, families, and scholars who identified as Black or African American. It also gave me a chance at that launch of the school year to make a commitment that this would be an organizational priority and a multi-year priority, that I would personally take responsibility in learning, leading, and being an ally in the work with the DEI working group and our DEI team led by Jessica. And that's really what then launched the more direct work around anti-racism and being a pro-Black school system. And so we have a roadmap or a strategic plan. It has three components. One is around vision, plan, and communications. One set is around learning across the organization. Jessica talked a little bit about how we launched that with Promise 54. And the third area is disrupting and reinventing practices, behaviors, and policies that have disproportionate impact on any marginalized group, but starting with Black and African American stakeholders. So let me stop there and maybe bump it back to Xiomara.
That's awesome. Thank you. There's some comments in the chat about how helpful it is to hear about the journey to date and also about what's in your plan right now. So thank you both for sharing that. I want to double click here just one time, and then we're going to shift gears just a little bit. But one double click before we do. What, real talk, and it might be different for each of you, given your vantage points in the organization, et cetera. What held you back from going here sooner as an organization? Honest thoughts. What held you back from zooming in on anti-Blackness sooner?
I think my perspective is going to be different but maybe it's the same. I don't know. Daniel, let me know. But like because I'm Black in the organization. So I think for me, it was like the lack of belief. So, and we'll probably talk about this a little bit more. Like we had data, and Dan mentioned it before, like in 2017, we had data that for at least our Black staff in our home office is a negative 100 promoter score. You can't get any lower. But like it didn't seem to be believed, or the stories of Black people did not seem to be believed, right? It was the need to continuously explain, like, this is why we must focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion, because it's important for Black people and other people here to feel like they belong. Like, to me, it was the time spent to explain, to bring people along, that has not gotten us here sooner, right? And so if there's one thing that I can say to everyone sitting in this room is like, believe Black people. That's it, right? When you spend time questioning them about their experiences, when you spend time questioning people of color, any other marginalized or impacted community about their experiences, oh, does this really happen to you? You're really wasting time about getting to like what could be the solution. So believe them when they say it is what I would say.
Thanks, Jessica. What about you, Dan?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. I would also say that one lesson here is, I think I tried, and maybe other executive leaders and school leaders, we kind of put this on the sidewalk, not the highway. It was something else that we were doing on top of our strategic plan that we were very intentional about. We had goals, we had objectives, we had measures of success, we had a dashboard, we had resources connected to that, we had a multi-year arc for the work. And then there was this other DEI work that we were doing. That has now dramatically changed. And it changed when we named it as an organizational priority in August 2020. It now is center stage. It is now in the highway. But I think we tried to make it sidewalk. I think that's one thing that happened, in addition to what Jessica said. And the third one that it's just reflecting back is, even though we have a diverse staff and a diverse group of leaders, we did not have a Black or African-American chief on the cabinet. And we had a number of them in the VP leadership team, but many of us, myself included, were climbing up the learning mountain. At the same time, we were trying to understand what actions we should take or not take. And we were just not bold enough. We did not believe enough, as Jessica said. We did not center it as the most important thing or one of a very few handful of most important things for us to commit to and do as leaders. So those are some other reflections that I might add.
Thanks, y'all. Okay, as promised, I want to pause and give folks just about a minute to think on your own, maybe jot some notes for yourself. You don't need to share this with anyone. Where is your organization in your own journey right now? To what degree are you centering anti-Blackness in your work? What's holding you back right now? Just take a minute and jot some thoughts based on what you've heard so far, and then we'll shift gears just a little bit. All right. So what I'd love to do is pick up on a thread that is already out in the air in relation to data. Jessica, you said, believe Black people. So simple and yet so incredibly important to hear and repeat and do. In my experience anyway, there's usually already a lot of data available, and it sounds like that maybe aligns with your the experience that you've both had at Alliance as well. That lived experiences and stories and feedback are often being shared every single day. And if we can create the conditions of psychological safety and trust in relationships, if we can help people skill up around radical candor, but also how to receive information that might be hard to hear, then there's even more of that data around every single day. So I'm curious, is there more either of you want to say in relation to the data that was already available, that was already in the midst, that perhaps you were hesitant or resistant to fully hear and let sink in?
I mean, I might just start, Jessica, I'd love to hear what you think about this too. Like when we wrote up without attribution, all of the horrors that our scholars, our Black and African-American scholars, families, and staff were feeling with their real examples, with the real language used against them or actions perpetuated on them. I think for me personally, that was the most powerful call to action. Yeah, I'll just stop there. The numbers mattered, but they were easier for us to kind of push them aside. But the lived experiences over and over again in a single written document, and Jessica heard it live as well. Can't even imagine what that space was like. That was the most powerful wake-up call for me.
Yeah, I think This is an interesting and good question. Don't know if I have a great answer, so we'll see where this goes. But I think that those experiences were powerful. When I heard them, though, to me it wasn't like, it was shocking, but I also wasn't surprised, because I was like, oh, this makes sense why Black people at the home office feel X way. Right? Because you're not going to have staff at a school, if you're in a school system, you're not going to have Black staff at a school site, and then your Black staff at the home office. Their experiences are going to be connected. If anti-Blackness is in your organization, the experiences are going to be connected. The degree to which they feel it, how they experience it may be different, right? And so when I heard from Black staff and scholars and families, I was like, oh, no, this makes sense, because my experience here is X, or the experience of this other Black colleague that I have at the home office is X. So again, I think it existed already. I think I saw a comment in the chat about like, what is the burden of people of color, Black people, to raise that to organizational leadership? And it is a risk. It really, really is a really big risk. And so I think the question for leaders is, how are you building spaces of trust and community? How are you asking the questions? How are you creating the dynamic in which you can see some of these things and not necessarily put the burden on Black people to have to continually raise them, right? Because the data from the forums is powerful, but it's also people's lived experiences. So people had to sit in a room, right? Relive whatever they've been through so that we could write it down on paper, so that we can then like use that to like propel the organization forward. And that is a burden, right? So what are the ways, I think there's data always around you. So what are the ways in which you may be just ignoring it and then asking yourself, why am I doing that, right? And I think sometimes if you slow down and create intentional space for that data to be seen, to be heard, to be valued, as much as like quantitative data is, you'll already have it in front of you.
And can we just go a little bit further into this question from the chat about burden and consequences? I'm curious what y'all have done at Alliance and the degree to which you feel like it might be successful or not successful, what you've learned from it around helping support your Black staff who are, Jessica, you're leading the DEI efforts, very much centering anti-Blackness in that plan. What have you all put into place broader, in terms of Alliance generally, to help support staff of color and Black staff in particular as they shoulder this additional burden? And or what have you all put in place to try to insulate folks from the consequences that might come from raising these sorts of experiences and traumas in service of trying to help the organization to really move forward? Are there lessons you've learned from what you've put in place, whether it's been working or not working, that you would share with folks? That's intended for either of you, by the way.
I think, I don't know, Dan, you might be able to answer. I think we're still figuring that out, just to be honest. I think that's why I was like, this is a great question. I don't know the answer. It's actually a conversation we're currently in. It's a conversation that I've had with Dan directly. And it's a conversation that we are currently in, and I don't think we have an answer. So part of this work is just being honest about when we haven't figured it out. And that's, in my opinion right now, that's not something that we have figured out.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And Zimmer, you asked kind of a two-part question. One is like the safe space to even raise an issue, say the thing, so that it's heard authentically and hopefully then like believed and then acted on. I think we are not perfect there, but we are way better at that now than at the beginning part of the journey. And so some of that has been through training, leader training, which is the first place we started on leader education, so that they could open up conversations around race and provide what would be hoped for as safe spaces for people to be able to speak their truth to leaders who would have the power then to do something about it. I would also say having a DEI working group that came up organically in the organization is also a space that has been very powerful for people to have direct and honest conversations. And I'm the executive sponsor of that group. So I hear nearly all of those conversations, and then I can act on them. We have equity teams now in many of our schools with a similar conversation going on, so that change can actually be made both from the ground up and with the leader as leading or as an ally in formulating the path to change at the school level. So I think from a listening, hearing, and acting perspective, we're doing much better. It is not perfect. But I think Jessica's right on the kind of first part of your question, Ziamara, which is, are we lowering the burden? Have we figured out how to not put the work on Black staff and or people of color? One of the shifts that we're making some small shifts. So for example, the forum last year was the Black and African American Forum last year, which is a private affinity space for Black and African American scholars, families, and staff. Last year, it had double purpose. It was to get their feedback on the priorities that we named in the roadmap. And it was to provide them a community space just to share with each other, celebrate, and or share their lived experiences. This year, we're expanding affinity spaces to other groups, but we are taking out the burden of, tell us what you think about this priority. What do you think about the way that we're doing this? We're going to find other ways across the organization to collect that data, but we are not going to put that on the Black and African American community. And that's because we had that experience last year and realized, oh, this is not a good thing long-term for us to continually going back to them and asking them when we should be stepping forward and figuring this out for ourselves or in other ways. But we're at the early stages of those shifts.
Thank you. Well, I super appreciate you both answering both parts of the question. Like, what are all the things you're trying to do to help share and alleviate this burden and also insulate folks, in particular Black staff, from the consequences that can come with the sorts of work and elevating a voice and experiences that is happening. And the truth check on, like, is it working or not, is the other part of the question, which I feel like, Jessica, is where you started, of like, you know, we're on our way, but is it working entirely? Not yet. So I feel like both parts are really important, you know, like what are all the things we put in place, but also like we got to step back and do the truth check and ask the people who would ultimately be feeling most of that burden or the potential consequences, to what degree is it working? So thank you for collectively taking on both parts of that question. I have one more question for each of you. I'm cognizant we just have a couple more minutes together before we pull back into the main room. Dan, I'm wondering if I can ask you a little bit about mirror work, and then Jessica, I want to ask you a little bit about self-care. Dan, I feel like this idea of individual mirror work is so critical that each and every one of us needs to engage in our own work to understand what are the messages that we've internalized through our lives, through our experiences about race, about Blackness, about white superiority, and how might they be playing out in our leadership, in our decision-making, our communications, et cetera. I'm curious, Dan, would you share a little bit about how do you engage in your own personal mirror work here? What are some of the things that maybe you've come to realize that you might be willing to generously share that perhaps others could learn from in relation to that personal mirror work? And then I'm gonna circle back and let you close this out, Jessica, with one last question.
Sure, happy to. So Truth in Advertising, Ziamara is my executive coach for my mirror work. And so that's been a great privilege because and by the way, all of our executive team has a DEI coach exactly for this reason, because it's difficult and things come up and you have your own personal biases that you need to unpack. And it's great to have a third party coach who's steeped in this work to be helpful with that. So look, my entire first year, I worked on intent versus impact. I could not break through on that. It took me an entire year to understand how I showed up in a room as a white guy who is number one on the hierarchical chain, how I wasn't just one person at the table, or how I said something might, even with the most generous goodwill, of intent was felt differently. And it took me a long time to get over that and really have the language and the understanding to truly listen, enter into spaces, understanding my power and privilege, and how to change that. And if I did have a hurtful or negative impact on someone, how to do the work to name it, be okay with it, and then repair it. Since then, a lot of the work that I've been doing is how do I help other leaders, in addition to my own work, but how do I take like what I've been learning as I climb up the mountain and share those experiences and lessons with other leaders so that they can climb up the mountain faster. And that's been really important to me and to help my executive team with that, because no matter how much better I get at the DEI and anti-racism work, and by the way, it's slow going, I will admit that, the organization is only going to get better if every leader in every space has the tools and the ability to do that mirror work for themselves. So Zimmer, I don't know if I answered your question, but there you go.
Thank you so much. All right, Jessica, in our last minute, I'd love for you to close us out. And in terms of a prompt, I'm curious if you might share, how are you taking care of yourself in the midst of all this? How are you restoring yourself? How are you healing? How are you taking care of yourself? Any lessons you've learned there that you might want to share?
Yeah, I think so. One, I also have a coach. Can't advertise as much coaching as necessary. And I think like creating that intentional space for me to stop, to process, to like debrief something really difficult that happened or figure out how to enter into another space has been essential. I've been working with the same coach for the last 2.5 years, and I would not be able to show up in space without that space. I just wouldn't be able to do it. I think secondly, boundaries. I am the type of person that goes all in, especially when I believe about something, I will go all in, right? And I've had to learn that that is not going to serve me and is not going to serve the work. So I put boundaries in place, like, no, I'm sorry, I cannot do this, right? Which goes back to earlier, this conversation where I was like, should I show up today? Should I not, right? And sometimes I have to do that with people. Like Dan and I have had some hard conversations too, right? About like, what is my boundary? Where do we need to navigate things in our relationship as we work on this work together? And then I think the other thing that grounds me is community. You can't do this alone. There is no way, right? So I have a personal community, I have a professional community that like holds me up when I'm tired, right? And I can do the same for them.
Love it. Thank you both so very much. Just appreciate your honesty, your vulnerability, your willingness to share, even as it's all unfolding in real time. And there's a whole lot of love for you in the chat. So we're going to head on back to the main room for a quick close. But if you didn't see the chat, please take a minute to review that. And just thank you so much, Dan and Jessica, for the incredibly
Right, welcome back, everyone. And I'll wait a few more seconds for everyone to join. Awesome. Well, that time flew by. We know there was likely so much more that we would have wanted to dive into, but we are so deeply grateful for our speakers / facilitators today for joining. Thanks to Jessica, Dan, Kira, and Dr. Rob for joining us. We're so grateful for your time, your energy, your vulnerability, your brilliance. And as we close, we want to invite you all to join us for the remainder of our webinar series. We are diving into similar conversations on a variety of topics. Tomorrow we'll be talking about funders and the role of philanthropy as we think about DEI and anti-racism work in education. So it'll be a really great conversation. And we've got an amazing lineup of both topics and speakers to continue to dig into and reflect some of these key topics and themes as we think about the learnings that we are carrying from our Unrealized Impact 2.0 report. So dropping in the chat right here, a link to all of the webinars. You can register. Again, they are all free. And we'd love your help in amplifying and sharing this with your networks. Additionally, if you think your organization could benefit from some support, we currently have applications open for our DEI Accelerator, which is one of our cohort experiences that we referenced earlier, that can provide some high-level support for your organization to develop a DEI plan and approach, and get some coaching and connect with other organizations engaging in the work along the way. So dropping a link in the chat for you to find out more information there. And then finally, we would love some feedback from you. We are always learning, always growing individually and as an organization. And we would really appreciate your thoughts, your feedback as to how you experienced today's conversation, both to help inform our work moving forward in future webinars, and also to help us understand our impact and communicate our impact. So we would be deeply grateful if you would take a quick moment right now to fill out. It shouldn't take longer than 2 minutes to complete. Great, and with that, we are at time. We will officially close. And just a huge thank you for everyone who showed up today, who came to listen, to learn, to share. It is critical for all of us collectively to engage in the work of dismantling white supremacy and systems of oppression within ourselves and across our sector. So grateful for the work that you are all doing on a daily basis to lean into that and to live into our values every day. Thanks so much. Have a great day. See you all soon.